GM made record billions. Detroit got 1,145 layoffs. Cold open. There is a number that should not exist. In 2024, General Motors, under CEO Mary Barra, recorded $14.9 billion in net profit. Record profits. The kind of number that gets announced on an investor call with visible satisfaction, that pushes a stock price up 55% in a single year, that allows a company to return $45 billion to its shareholders across a decade. GM launched $10 billion in buybacks in 2023, followed by $6 billion programs in both 2024 and 2025. And then, on the eve of the Christmas holiday shutdown, General Motors sent permanent layoff notices to 1,145 workers at its Factory Zero plant in Detroit. Not temporary, permanent. The layoffs were set to take effect January 5th, 2026, the day the holiday break ended. Workers found out before Christmas. They went home for the holidays, knowing they would not be returning to the floor. There was no financial crisis behind this, no bankruptcy filing, no emergency board meeting to rescue a failing company. The company that issued those notices is the same company that, weeks earlier, raised its own profit forecast and continued executing on a share buyback program. That is what this story is about. Not the decline of Detroit. That story has been told at length. This is about something more recent and more disorienting, what it looks like when a company lays off workers because it is succeeding, and what that decision costs the city left holding it. Section 1. The number that doesn't fit. The math at General Motors in late 2025 looked like this. Net profit in 2024, $14.9 billion. Projected net profit for 2025, between $12 and $13 billion. The company raised its own estimate in October, one of the clearest signals of corporate confidence that exists. GM stock over the prior 12 months had climbed approximately 55%. Over the prior decade, through a combination of dividends and share buybacks, the company returned roughly $45 billion to its shareholders. That figure represents 58.4% of GM's current market capitalization, more than double the median payout ratio for companies listed on the S&P 500. These numbers did not come from critics. They came from the company's own investor communications. Mary Barra, in those calls, described GM's capital allocation strategy as one of reinvesting in the business while returning capital to shareholders. A $10 billion buyback program launched in 2023 was presented as a signal of confidence in the company's future. 1,145 workers at Factory Zero, permanently cut, 550 more at the Ultium Cells battery plant in Lordstown, Ohio, indefinitely laid off. The workers at Factory Zero had spent much of 2024 working 72 to 80-hour weeks. That is the kind of schedule a company deploys when it needs everything a worker has. Both shifts were placed on temporary layoff late in the year. Then the permanent notices followed. There is a version of the story that places the profits in one room and the layoffs in another, where the shareholder returns belong to investors and the job losses belong to labor, and the two never have to share a sentence. That separation is how most corporate communications are structured. It is how most business coverage treats these events. What makes this particular moment worth examining is that the separation no longer holds. The same earnings calls that celebrated record returns also noted, without apparent tension, that production at Factory Zero was being reduced to a single shift. The same company, the same quarter, the same reporting year. The numbers are not contradictory by accident. The numbers are not contradictory at all. That is precisely the problem. Factory Zero did not begin as a layoff story. It began as a promise. But to understand that promise, you have to start 40 years earlier. In 1981, the city of Detroit used eminent domain to demolish 1,400 homes and displace 4,200 residents, an entire neighborhood called Poletown, so that General Motors could build an assembly plant on that site. The city sacrificed a community for the jobs General Motors would bring. That transaction was controversial then. What happened next gives it a different kind of weight. When General Motors retooled that same Detroit Hamtramck assembly plant, a facility that straddles the border between Detroit and the neighboring city of Hamtramck, and reopened it as Factory Zero in 2021, the announcement carried specific weight. This was the company's flagship electric vehicle facility, the physical proof that the largest American automaker was committed to moving away from fossil fuel vehicles. It was named to signal a destination: zero emissions, zero crashes, zero congestion. General Motors leadership described it as a cornerstone of the company's electric future. The plant was producing the GMC Hummer EV, the Chevrolet Silverado EV, and the Cadillac Escalade IQ, the headline vehicles of General Motors' electric transition. The workers who took jobs there accepted a version of that story. Many of them gave the plant years. In 2024, they gave it the kind of hours that leave little room for anything else. 72 hours a week. 80. The electric vehicle ramp-up required it, and they provided it. The United Auto Workers, specifically UAW Local 22, the local representing Factory Zero workers, had negotiated what was widely described as a historic contract covering these workers. The promise of stable, well-paid jobs in the clean energy transition had been a central argument in the political case for that transition. Politicians at every level pointed to plants like Factory Zero as evidence that shifting away from combustion engines would not come at the cost of the American manufacturing workforce. Then electric vehicle demand softened, not collapsed. Softened. Consumer uptake moved more slowly than projections had anticipated. GM recalibrated its targets, and within months of the workers who had run 80-hour weeks delivering those targets, permanent layoff notices went out. The gap between what Factory Zero was announced to be and what happened to the people who built it is not a small one. It is the distance between a company's public narrative about its own future and the operational decisions that future actually requires. In 1981, a neighborhood was cleared so GM could build here. In 2025, GM reduced the workforce here while posting record profits. The site has now absorbed two separate moments in which the city's interests and the company's interests pointed in the same direction until they didn't. That distance is where this story lives. The instinct, when a story like this takes shape, is to explain it as failure. General Motors is failing at electric vehicles. The transition is stumbling. Detroit is declining again. These frameworks are available, they get deployed quickly, and they are not entirely wrong. But they are incomplete. The part they leave out is the part that makes this moment more significant than a single plant closure at a single company in a single city. The layoffs at Factory Zero are not evidence of a company in distress. They are evidence of a company operating exactly as it was designed to. Here is the mechanism. For the past decade, the dominant metric for evaluating a publicly traded American corporation has not been workforce size or production output or long-term community investment. It has been shareholder return, dividends paid, shares repurchased, the quarterly multiple. A company that grows its profit but fails to return that profit to its investor base will face sustained pressure from the financial community. A company that does both, grows profit and returns capital, is, by the metrics that currently govern corporate behavior in America, succeeding. General Motors has been succeeding. When EV demand softened through 2024 and into 2025, General Motors faced a choice. It could maintain Factory Zero's full workforce and absorb the margin impact while the market caught up to projections. Or it could reduce production to match actual demand, cut the labor costs that represent the most adjustable line item on a manufacturer's balance sheet, and protect the returns its shareholder base had come to depend on. The second option does not require malice. It does not require indifference to the workers involved, though the timing of Holiday Eve permanent notices suggests indifference was not a deciding barrier. What it requires is a company behaving like what it is, an entity whose primary obligation runs to its shareholders, not to the city it operates in, not to the workers who built its products, not to the political promises made in its name at a press event about the future. This is not a flaw specific to General Motors. It is the operating logic of the modern, publicly traded corporation. What makes Detroit the right city for this story is that Detroit has experienced this logic longer and more completely than almost anywhere else in America. The city has watched anchor employers contract or exit, not because the city failed, but because the financial math pointed elsewhere. The plant that was supposed to define General Motors' electric future is now producing fewer vehicles. The workers who ran it through 2 years of 80-hour weeks are gone. The profit margin is intact. The reason this happened is not complicated. The reason is that it was structurally permitted and then financially rewarded. Detroit's poverty statistics are not difficult to find. The official poverty rate in the city sits at roughly 35%. Among children, the figure reaches 51%. More than half of the children in Detroit are growing up in poverty. These numbers predate the Factory Zero layoffs. They are the product of decisions made by dozens of companies across multiple industries, compounded by policy failures at the city, state, and federal level across several decades. They accelerated through decades of white flight and disinvestment that hollowed out the city's tax base long before any single plant closure. They culminated in some sense in 2013 when Detroit filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history, $18 billion in debt, a city reduced to negotiating which of its obligations it could still honor. No single plant closure created them, and no single plant remaining open would resolve them. But anchor employers matter to cities in ways that balance sheets do not capture. When a large plant closes or scales back significantly, the damage does not stay contained to the workers who lose their jobs directly. It extends to the suppliers that service the plant, the restaurants and retailers in the surrounding area that depended on workers with regular paychecks, the property tax base that funds schools and basic infrastructure, and the signal it sends to other potential investors about whether this is a city worth committing capital to. Factory Zero employed over 3,000 workers at various points during its ramp-up. The 1,145 who received permanent notices represent a single event in a city that has absorbed many of them. But these events compound. They do not offset each other over time. What is particular about this moment is the contrast it presents. GM is not leaving Detroit because it has nothing left to draw from the city. Factory Zero still operates, at reduced capacity, on a site that was once cleared of an entire neighborhood to make room for it. The company's North American headquarters remain in Detroit. The leadership making these decisions still works there. The layoffs did not happen because GM is abandoning Detroit. They happened because, inside the financial model that governs GM's decisions, the workers at Factory Zero represented a variable cost that could be reduced without threatening the outputs the model measures and rewards. Detroit is not the victim of corporate decline in this story. It is the site of corporate optimization. That distinction matters because it changes the right question to ask. The question is not what happened to Detroit. The question is what kind of company is permitted to operate this way, and what obligation it carries to the place where it built itself. Factory Zero is not an isolated incident. In early 2026, Ford Motor Company permanently laid off all 1,600 workers at its Blue Oval SK Battery Park electric vehicle battery plant in Glendale, Kentucky. The plant had been positioned, publicly and prominently, as a pillar of Ford's electric future. When demand projections shifted, the jobs went with them. Across the broader manufacturing sector, the first months of 2026 produced a pattern that economists and labor analysts are beginning to describe not as a cyclical slowdown, but as a structural reshaping. Tyson Foods eliminated 3,200 jobs in Lexington, Nebraska. Polaris closed its Wisconsin manufacturing facility. Stellantis permanently shuttered its historic Vauxhall factory in Luton, England, after 120 years of continuous operation. Each of these closures has a local story: a city, a workforce, a supply chain, a tax base absorbing the impact. But the mechanism is consistent across all of them. Companies that are financially stable, or better than stable, making decisions to reduce their labor footprint in ways that protect or improve their margins without threatening the core business. The electric vehicle transition has added a particular layer to this pattern. The political argument for electrification was built, in part, on the premise that it would not hollow out the manufacturing workforce. The jobs would shift, but they would stay. Factory Zero was presented as proof of that argument. What happened to Factory Zero and to Ford's Blue Oval SK plant in Kentucky and to the battery facilities being wound down or retooled across the Midwest is evidence of something else. The promise held as long as the growth projections held. When demand softened, the calculus changed. Workers who had restructured their working lives around a company's publicly stated version of the future found themselves on the wrong side of a revised forecast. This is not new. The Rust Belt is the long history of exactly this dynamic. Industries that left when the math shifted. Companies that extracted value from communities and exited when a better return appeared elsewhere. What is different now is that it is happening again, inside the industry that was supposed to replace the one that left the first time. Close. The workers at Factory Zero did not lose their jobs because General Motors failed. They lost them because inside the model that governs how that company makes decisions, reducing that workforce was the correct move. That is a harder problem than decline. Decline has a narrative. A company that ran out of ideas, a city that could not adapt, an industry that could not compete. There is a shape to it. What happened at Factory Zero does not have that shape. It has a balance sheet, a shareholder return target, and a production forecast that needed adjusting. The cities most exposed to this pattern going forward are not necessarily the ones that look the most distressed. They are the ones most dependent on a single large employer whose financial model does not require their long-term stability to keep performing. That exposure can sit in a Rust Belt city with a shuttered steel mill. It can just as easily sit in a city that hosted the flagship plant of an automaker at record profit. Detroit has absorbed versions of this before. In 1981, a neighborhood called Poletown was demolished so GM could build here. In 2013, the city filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. And now, in 2025, the flagship electric vehicle plant on that same cleared ground cut over 1,000 workers while the company posted record profits. What Factory Zero puts back on the table is whether any of that history has changed the relationship between cities and the companies that shape them, or whether the same decisions will keep producing the same outcomes across different decades, under different brand names, with different press releases about the future attached. The workers who ran 80-hour weeks in 2024 already know the answer. The numbers already told it.